The 1982 Falklands War stemmed from a long-standing sovereignty dispute between Britain and Argentina. British forces launched a transatlantic expedition, securing victory through intense naval and aerial battles followed by ground assaults. This conflict reshaped the fortunes of both nations. Margaret Thatcher's prestige soared, while Argentina's military junta collapsed. Yet the sovereignty dispute over the Falkland Islands, spanning over for decades, remains unresolved to this day. On January 3, 2026, an announcement from Argentina's Ministry of Foreign Affairs once again drew global attention to the waters of the South Atlantic, the Malvinas Islands. The statement reaffirmed Argentina's legitimate sovereignty over the Falkland Islands and surrounding waters, calling for the resumption of peaceful negotiations with the United Kingdom. This decades-long sovereignty dispute traces its roots to the brutal 74-day War of 1982, as the smoke of battle cleared, the glory of victory and the bitterness of defeat settled. Yet the question of the Falklands ownership simmered like undisturbed currents beneath the South Atlantic, never truly quelled. On the morning of April 2, 1982, before the dawn light had pierced the clouds over the South Atlantic, Argentine troops had already silently set foot on the soil of the Malvinas Islands. This unannounced assault sliced through the calm of the South Atlantic like a sharp blade, instantly placing the islands under Argentine control. News of the invasion sent shockwaves through Britain. This distant overseas territory could not be lost. The British government swiftly mobilized its military machinery. A task force composed of elite units was urgently assembled, setting sail across the vast South Atlantic with the nation's hopes riding on its mission. Among these forces, the 3rd Assault Brigade and the 5th Infantry Brigade bore the critical responsibility of reclaiming the Falklands from the land. Yet the outbreak of this war was not a random military gamble, but the inevitable outcome of long-standing sovereignty disputes between Britain and Argentina, intertwined with domestic political dynamics. The Malvinas Islands lie in the South Atlantic, approximately 500 kilometers east of Argentina's mainland coast and over 13,000 kilometers from the British mainland. Despite their harsh climate and limited resources, this archipelago, spanning roughly 12,000 square kilometers, holds strategic importance due to its position on key South Atlantic shipping routes, coupled with potential resource development value. This made it a long-standing focal point of contention between Britain and Argentina. The history of the sovereignty dispute dates back to the 18th century. France first established settlements on the islands in 1764, followed by British and Spanish interventions. After multiple changes in control, Britain formally occupied the Falklands in 1833 and has maintained jurisdiction ever since. Since gaining independence in 1816, Argentina has consistently asserted that the Falklands are part of Spain's colonial legacy and rightfully belong to Argentina. This claim has garnered support from most Latin American nations. Britain, however, has refused to negotiate over sovereignty, citing historical jurisdiction and the self-determination of the islanders. In the 1980s, Argentina's domestic political and economic crisis became the fuse that ignited the war. At the time, Argentine military junta leader General Galtieri faced severe governance challenges, domestic economic decline, skyrocketing inflation, soaring unemployment, and mounting public discontent. To divert domestic conflicts and rally national consensus, the junta turned its attention to the Falklands sovereignty issue, believing that reclaiming the islands would significantly boost the government's prestige. After internal deliberations, the junta erroneously concluded that Britain, separated from the Falklands by vast oceans, would be unable to effectively intervene. They reasoned that a military campaign against the Falklands would not only be costly and time-consuming but could also compromise Argentina's defense commitments within relevant international organizations. Consequently, they assumed Britain would not wage a major war to reclaim the islands. Under this misjudgment, the Argentine junta began secretly preparing for military action, a process that failed to raise sufficient alarm in Britain. On March 19, 1982, Argentine businessmen led workers to land on South Georgia Island east of the Falklands, raising the Argentine flag, an act that became the direct trigger for war. Seizing this opportunity, the Argentine junta launched a surprise assault on the Falklands at dawn on April 2nd, deploying approximately 4,000 troops from land, sea, and air forces. The British garrison on the islands consisted only of a small contingent of Royal Marines. Facing overwhelming odds, they were quickly forced to surrender. Argentine forces smoothly occupied Stanley, the capital of the Falkland Islands, and declared the restoration of Argentine sovereignty over the territory. Upon receiving the news, then British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher immediately convened an emergency cabinet meeting, issuing a firm statement that the Falkland Islands would not be relinquished. The British Parliament swiftly passed a resolution severing diplomatic ties with Argentina and initiating military mobilization, marking the beginning of a military expedition spanning thousands of miles. The speed of Britain's military mobilization far exceeded the Argentine military junta's expectations. On April 5th, just 3 days after Argentina's occupation of the islands, the vanguard of the British task force set sail from Portsmouth, heading toward the distant South Atlantic. This task force was a veritable melting pot of nations and an emergency assembly. Its core strength included 2 aircraft carriers, MS Invincible and MS Hermes, carrying Harrier vertical takeoff and landing fighters. Additionally, it comprised 118 vessels of various types, including destroyers, frigates, submarines, and amphibious assault ships. After later reinforcements, the total British combat strength reached 35,000 personnel and over 270 aircraft. To ensure supply lines for the long expedition, Britain urgently requisitioned numerous civilian vessels, ocean liners, cargo ships, tankers which were rapidly converted into troop transports, supply ships, and even hospital ships, becoming indispensable components of the task force. For instance, the ocean liner Queen Elizabeth II, later carrying the 5th Infantry Brigade, was originally a luxury transatlantic passenger ship. After requisition, it had some passenger facilities removed and was fitted with basic military communications equipment and protective armor, enabling it to transport thousands of soldiers to the battlefield in a single voyage. As the task force set sail, the harsh weather of the South Atlantic began too. April in the southern hemisphere marked the transition between autumn and winter, bringing frequent gales and towering waves. Temperatures plunged to below -10 degrees Celsius, posing a severe challenge to both the fleet's navigational safety and the physical and psychological endurance of the troops. During the voyage, the fleet conducted adaptive training while formulating operational plans. The British military's core strategic approach was clear. First, seize control of the seas and skies around the Falkland Islands, severing Argentine supply lines and reinforcements. Then execute an amphibious landing to ultimately reclaim the islands. Meanwhile, after occupying the Falklands, Argentina rapidly bolstered its garrison there. By the outbreak of war, the Argentine force on the islands numbered 13,000 troops under the unified command of Mario Jorge Menendez. Argentina's defensive strategy prioritized the east over the west, concentrating its main forces around Stanley Harbor and surrounding strategic points. They built fortifications using the terrain and laid extensive minefields across the island, aiming to halt the British landing assault. Argentina committed a total of 65,000 troops to the conflict, supported by 33 vessels and over 250 combat aircraft. Among these, the Super Étendards fighter jets and Exocet anti-ship missiles acquired from France represented the most formidable weapons in the Argentine arsenal. Recapturing the Falklands demanded first securing air and naval supremacy over the region akin to clearing outer defenses before storming a fortress. The opening month of hostilities witnessed a gripping aerial and naval confrontation between British and Argentine warships and aircraft across the South Atlantic. On April 25th, the vanguard of the British task force arrived near South Georgia Island and launched an assault, the first direct confrontation between the two sides. Special Air Service SAS troops were airlifted by helicopters onto the island, engaging in fierce combat with Argentine defenders. They ultimately captured the island's capital and took dozens of Argentine soldiers prisoner. Though small in scale, this battle significantly boosted British morale and gave the Argentine military its first taste of British combat capability. Subsequently, the British task force established a 200 nautical mile maritime exclusion zone around the Falkland Islands, declaring any Argentine vessels entering the area would be treated as hostile targets. Initially, the Argentine Navy attempted direct confrontation with the British forces, but the British submarine force quickly demonstrated formidable deterrence. The nuclear-powered submarine Conqueror, serving as the underwater spearhead of the British task force, lay in stealthy vigilance around the Falkland Islands, closely monitoring the movements of the Argentine Navy. On May 2nd, Conqueror detected the Argentine Navy's flagship warship, the cruiser General Belgrano. Originally a World War II vessel from the U.S. Navy, the cruiser had been purchased and modernized by Argentina, boasting a displacement exceeding 13,000 tons and serving as one of the Argentine Navy's flagship vessels. At the time, the General Belgrano was sailing outside the British-imposed blockade zone. However, after urgent assessment, British command deemed it a potential threat and decisively ordered the Conqueror to launch an attack. 2 torpedoes launched from the Conqueror struck the General Belgrano with precision, one hitting the bow, the other striking the ammunition magazine in the ship's midsection. A massive explosion instantly reverberated across the sea, causing the General Belgrano to least rapidly as vast quantities of seawater flooded the compartments. Argentine sailors aboard the ship plunged into chaos, leaping into the icy waters of the South Atlantic. Many perished from hypothermia or drowning. Ultimately, the General Belgrano sank within an hour of being struck, with 323 Argentine sailors forever resting beneath the frigid sea. This devastating blow utterly shattered the Argentine Navy's resolve. The Galtieri Junta urgently ordered the main fleet to retreat to home ports, withdrawing from frontline combat. From that moment, the British firmly seized control of the seas, severing Argentina's maritime supply lines to the Falklands and laying the groundwork for subsequent amphibious operations. After the Argentine Navy withdrew from the battlefield, the Argentine military did not sit idly by. They pinned their hopes on the Air Force, launching a tenacious counterattack with super Étendards fighter jets and Exocet anti-ship missiles imported from France. The Exocet anti-ship missile was among the world's most advanced anti-ship weapons at the time, renowned for its long range, high precision, and stealth capabilities. Paired with the super Étendards' exceptional low-altitude penetration capabilities, this combination formed a formidable strike force. Argentina had procured only 5 Exocet missiles from France, making this limited ammunition the Argentine Air Force's sole hope for turning the tide of battle. On May 4th, 2 super Étendards fighters took off from an Argentine airbase, flying at low altitude to evade British radar detection as they stealthily approached the British fleet. Upon reaching missile range, the aircraft rapidly climbed, locked onto targets, and launched Exocet missiles before immediately descending to withdraw. At that moment, the British destroyer HMS Sheffield was conducting fleet patrol duties. Its radar systems failed to detect the incoming missiles in time. One missile malfunctioned and missed its target, while the other struck the ship's midsection with precision. This missile penetrated the hull's steel plating, detonating inside the ship's compartments and igniting a massive fire. The Sheffield, one of the Royal Navy's most advanced destroyers costing $200 million, was equipped with state-of-the-art air defense systems and anti-ship weapons, representing a source of pride for the British military. However, the extensive use of aluminum alloy in the hull allowed the fire to spread rapidly and become uncontrollable. The ship's fire suppression systems were damaged in the explosion and proved ineffective. Crew members fought desperately to contain the blaze, but fierce winds in the South Atlantic intensified the fire, soon engulfing the entire hull in flames. The captain was forced to order abandon ship. Crew members jumped into the sea and were rescued by nearby British naval vessels. Ultimately, the Sheffield sank approximately 6 days after being hit, overwhelmed by the intense fire. The destroyer's loss dealt a severe blow to the British Navy and highlighted 2 nations worldwide. The immense power of anti-ship missiles in modern naval warfare. Within days, the Argentine Air Force launched multiple attacks against the British fleet, sinking several frigates and supply ships including MS Enthusiast, HMS Antelope, and JMS Coventry, while damaging numerous other vessels. British personnel and equipment suffered catastrophic losses. Yet the British Harrier jets, like aerial cheetahs, dominated the skies. Leveraging their unique vertical takeoff and landing capability alongside American Sidewinder air-to-air missiles, they operated with near invincibility, requiring no dedicated runways. Harriers could operate from aircraft carriers and rudimentary airfields, making them ideally suited for the complex waters surrounding the Falkland Islands. The American-supplied Sidewinder air-to-air missiles possessed exceptional maneuverability and accuracy, effectively neutralizing low-flying Argentine aircraft. Throughout the air campaign, British Harriers shot down 90 Argentine aircraft of various types without suffering a single loss, firmly securing local air superiority. Notably, following the outbreak of hostilities, the French government, under international pressure, imposed an arms embargo on Argentina. This halted deliveries of remaining Exocet missiles and super Étendards fighter components, significantly curtailing the Argentine Air Force's counterattack capabilities, a key factor in the Argentine military's defeat. Even as the smoke of naval and aerial combat had yet to dissipate, the curtain on ground operations quietly rose. In fact, long before May 1st, elite members of the British Special Air Service SAS had already commenced covert operations. As the most elite special forces unit within the British military, renowned for executing high-difficulty reconnaissance and raids behind enemy lines, the SAS served as the eyes and ears of the British forces during the Falklands War on April 21st. 30 SAS members split into 2 reconnaissance teams and were quietly airlifted by helicopter to South Georgia Island, located 1,300 kilometers east of the Falklands. At that time, South Georgia had already been occupied by Argentine forces. The SAS members' mission was to reconnoiter the deployment of Argentine troops and their defensive fortifications on the island, providing intelligence support for the subsequent British recapture of the territory. Moving stealthily across the island, they evaded Argentine patrols and gathered a wealth of critical intelligence, laying the groundwork for the British recapture of South Georgia on April 25th. Subsequently, reconnaissance operations targeting the Falkland Islands proper commenced in full force. SS personnel secretly landed on the islands in batches via submarines or helicopters, penetrating deep into Argentine-controlled zones. Their reconnaissance covered critical strategic areas including defensive deployments around Port Stanley, troop distributions at Darwin Harbor, landing conditions at Bluff Bay, and strategic high ground like Mount Kent, a key vantage point 10 kilometers from Port Stanley. During reconnaissance, SAS members repeatedly encountered Argentine patrols. Through exceptional close-quarters combat skills and stealth, they successfully evaded pursuit without detection. To obtain more precise intelligence, they even risked infiltrating near Argentine defensive positions, documenting the locations of firing points, ammunition depot distributions, and troop movements. This critical intelligence was promptly relayed to the British Task Force headquarters, providing a solid foundation for planning the amphibious assault. Based on SAS intelligence, the British command ultimately selected San Carlos Bay, their westernmost point of East Falkland, as the landing site. This location featured weak Argentine defenses, concealed terrain, and suitability for a large-scale amphibious operation. On May 21, 1982, San Carlos Bay at the western tip of East Falkland became the focal point of the British landing. Before dawn that day, the British 3rd Assault Brigade launched an assault on the bay's beaches using a combined sea and vertical assault approach. Amphibious assault ships carrying the sea landing forces approached the shore under naval gunfire cover. Meanwhile, vertical assault forces deployed via helicopters landed directly in open terrain behind the beachhead, seizing high ground to provide cover for the landing troops. Thanks to prior precision reconnaissance of Argentine troop deployments in the area by Special Air Service SAS personnel, the initial British landing encountered lethal resistance. Within just 4 hours, they established a 25-square-kilometer beachhead. However, the Argentine Air Force counterattack was swift and fierce. That morning, multiple types of Argentine fighter jets took off from their homeland and dove toward the landing zone. Defying British anti-aircraft fire, the Argentine aircraft launched attacks on British landing craft and beachhead positions. The British frigate HMS Honeymoon bore the brunt of the assault, struck by bombs dropped by Argentine aircraft. The ship exploded and caught fire instantly, sinking rapidly to the seabed. Additionally, 4 British vessels were damaged, including an amphibious assault ship and a supply ship. Fortunately, the Argentine Air Force concentrated its firepower primarily on British combat ships, allowing the amphibious assault forces tasked with troop transport to withdraw unscathed, suffering no significant casualties. Over the following days, the Argentine Air Force maintained relentless air assaults on the British landing zones in San Carlos Bay, deploying an average of over 120 sorties daily. Their objective was to destroy the landing beaches and prevent further British troop and supply landings. The British countered with Harrier jets and ship-based anti-aircraft missile systems, mounting fierce resistance against the Argentine air attacks. Fierce aerial combat and anti-aircraft engagements erupted over San Carlos Bay, while the sea was filled with continuous artillery fire and billowing smoke. By the evening of May 25th, the British first echelon over 5,000 soldiers and more than 32,000 tons of combat supplies had fully landed. The landing zone expanded to 150 square kilometers, firmly anchoring a stable foothold on the island. With their foothold secured, British forces began preparations to advance toward the Argentine core defense zone. Just as they were poised to push towards Stanley, disaster struck. 3 days after the landing operation concluded on May 25th, the Atlantic Conveyor, a merchant ship converted by the British Navy to transport helicopters and resupply materials, was sunk by Argentine airstrikes near San Carlos Bay. These merchant ships, requisitioned by the British and converted for transporting helicopters and combat supplies, carried over 10 Chinook heavy-lift helicopters, Wessex helicopters, and substantial munitions, food, and medical supplies. For the British forces engaged in a long-range expedition, this vessel served as the lifeblood of their logistics. Its loss plunged the subsequent British offensive into crisis. Compounding the crisis, between May 21st and 25th, the Argentine Air Force sank 4 British vessels and damaged several others steadily, increasing British equipment losses and casualties. As these grim reports reached Britain, public discontent erupted, fueling widespread social anxiety. Britain was already in an economic downturn with high unemployment, and public dissatisfaction with the government's governance had been simmering. The ongoing setbacks in the Falklands War only intensified these sentiments. Opposition parties seized the opportunity to pressure the Conservative government led by Margaret Thatcher, demanding a swift end to the conflict to prevent further losses. Under immense pressure, Thatcher publicly urged the British military to achieve tangible battlefield victories quickly to turn the tide of the war. The British Task Force Command also recognized that a decisive victory was urgently needed to boost morale and stabilize the domestic situation. The original plan had been to consolidate the landing zones and then launch a direct assault on the main Argentine force at Port Stanley. However, the sinking of the Atlantic Conveyor severely reduced the British transport capacity, making it impossible to rapidly deploy large numbers of troops and supplies to the front lines. Simultaneously, sustained air raids by the Argentine Air Force posed immense risks to British advances. Faced with this situation, Major General Julian Thompson, commander of the 3rd Assault Brigade, had to adjust plans. He decided to first attack Darwin Port and Goose Green settlements in southern Malvinas, eliminating Argentine forces in these areas to neutralize flank threats. Concurrently, capturing the local airstrips would establish air support bases for subsequent operations. Pressed by the situation, Brigadier Julian Thompson's decision represented an adjustment based on the actual battlefield conditions at the time. British intelligence had originally indicated that the Argentine garrisons at Darwin Port and Goose Green consisted of only a few hundred troops, suggesting a relatively straightforward capture. However, the reality stunned the British forces. Over 1,000 soldiers from Argentina's 12th Infantry Regiment were stationed here, equipped with heavy firepower including anti-aircraft guns, howitzers, and mortar. They had also constructed comprehensive defensive fortifications, including trenches, bunkers, and minefields. Compounding the challenge, the terrain in this area was flat and open, offering no natural cover. British assault forces would be highly exposed to Argentine fire, making combat extremely difficult. Port Darwin and Goose Green settlement, situated in southern Falkland Islands, served as a vital transport artery connecting the East and West Falkland Islands, while also functioning as a key southern supply hub. The Argentine deployment of substantial forces here aimed both to protect southern supply lines and to tie down British military strength, preventing a concentrated assault on Stanley. For the British, capturing these two locations would not only neutralize the flanking threat but also open the southern route to Stanley. Simultaneously, seizing the local airstrip would allow British helicopters and light aircraft to operate from there, enhancing logistical support and airlift capabilities. Therefore, despite the Argentine forces' strong defenses at these points, the British had to commit their full strength to capturing them. The assault was assigned to the 2nd Parachute Battalion of the 3rd Assault Brigade, an elite British unit renowned for its combat experience, and Battalion Commander H. Jones, a bold and decisive leader, assessed that while the Argentine forces possessed superior numbers and firepower, they lacked experience in night operations. He therefore planned a surprise night raid to catch the enemy off guard. Late on the night of May 27, 1982, supported by naval gunfire from a Royal Navy Type 21 frigate, soldiers of the 2nd Parachute Battalion quietly advanced toward Argentine positions at Darwin Harbor and Goose Green settlement. The assault commenced. Yet unexpectedly, an accidental intelligence leak completely undermined the British surprise operation. Just hours before the 2nd Parachute Battalion launched its assault, a BBC News program publicly reported on the British military's impending attack on Darwin Port and Goose Green. This report was immediately intercepted by Argentine forces, prompting the defenders to enter full combat readiness. They reinforced their fortifications, adjusted firepower deployments, and prepared for battle. The British surprise advantage vanished, and the battle became deadlocked from the outset. Advancing soldiers of the 2nd Parachute Battalion encountered intense Argentine resistance, fire halting their progress. Compounding the crisis, the Royal Navy frigate providing artillery support suffered a sudden malfunction, rendering its guns useless against Argentine positions and depriving the British of vital firepower. Compounding the difficulties, the weather over the Falkland Islands that day was severe gale force winds and extremely low visibility, preventing British Harrier jets from taking off to provide air support. Without aerial or naval firepower, the 2nd Parachute Battalion's offensive reached a critical impasse. Argentine machine guns, mortar, and howitzers relentlessly pounded British positions, inflicting mounting casualties. Faced with this desperate situation, Captain H. Jones observed his troops' stalled advance and flagging morale. To boost spirits and break the stalemate, he personally led a platoon of soldiers in a charge against an enemy machine gun position. During the assault, Captain Jones was tragically struck by 2 bullets and made the ultimate sacrifice. His death plunged the British soldiers into profound grief but also ignited their fighting spirit. The battalion commander's death did not break the spirit of the 2nd Parachute Battalion. Instead, it ignited their fighting resolve. The acting battalion commander immediately assumed command, swiftly adjusting tactics. Abandoning the frontal assault approach, they adopted a multi-pronged flanking maneuver, advancing toward the enemy positions with a pincer movement. Utilizing the slightest undulations in the terrain, the soldiers provided alternating cover as they slowly advanced toward the Argentine positions, engaging in close-quarters street fighting and positional warfare. The combat was exceptionally fierce, with every trench and bunker contested repeatedly. Hours later, the weather over the Falkland Islands finally improved. The gale subsided, visibility increased, and British Harrier jets arrived in time to provide air support. The Harriers struck like divine reinforcements from above, launching rocket and speed dive bomb attacks that precisely targeted Argentine machine gun positions, howitzer emplacements, and ammunition depots. Argentine firepower was instantly suppressed. The tide of battle swiftly turned. Under the combined pressure of British ground assaults and aerial bombardment, the remaining Argentine defenders gradually lost their capacity to resist and began retreating toward Goose Green village. The British forces pressed their advantage, encircling Goose Green. By this point, the Argentine garrison had suffered heavy casualties, exhausted their ammunition and supplies, and found themselves completely cut off. That evening, newly appointed battalion commander Kibi broadcast a surrender ultimatum to the Argentine defenders, explicitly warning that continued resistance would trigger carpet bombing to utterly destroy their positions. Simultaneously, Glover pledged to guarantee the safety of surrendering soldiers and grant them prisoner of war treatment in accordance with international law. After a night of deliberation, the cornered Argentine soldiers ultimately decided to lay down their arms and surrender. By dawn the next day, over 1,000 Argentine soldiers emerged from Goose Green village, surrendering their weapons to British forces. Darwin and Goose Green were successfully captured by the British. In this engagement, British forces eliminated over 250 Argentine troops, captured more than 1,400 prisoners, and suffered approximately 170 casualties. The capture of Darwin and Goose Green not only neutralized threats to the British flank but also provided a crucial forward base, significantly boosting morale. Just as British forces prepared to advance on Stanley, a crisis brewed on another front. A Special Air Service SAS reconnaissance team that had infiltrated Mount Kent was detected by Argentine troops. The Argentines immediately dispatched large numbers of special forces to reinforce the position, attempting to retake this strategic stronghold. Kent Hill, the highest peak in eastern Falkland Islands at over 600 meters, stood just over 10 kilometers from Stanley. Its summit offered commanding views over the entire town and surrounding areas. Controlling this vantage point would allow British forces to dominate Argentine defenders in Stanley from above, providing an ideal observation and fire support position for the impending assault, a site of immense strategic importance. The SAS squad infiltrating Kent Hill numbered only 12 men. Their mission was to reconnoiter Argentine defenses in Stanley Port and gather intelligence for the British assault. After being detected, the squad found itself immediately surrounded. Over 100 Argentine special forces, armed with heavy machine guns, mortar, and other firepower, launched a fierce assault. Leveraging their tactical expertise and intimate knowledge of the terrain, the SAS team engaged the enemy in the forests of Mount Kent. At this critical juncture, 42nd Commando received orders to reinforce the SAS team on Mount Kent, deploying by helicopter at full speed. The British forces masterfully employed helicopter insertion tactics during this reinforcement operation. Flying at low altitude, just above the treetops, they evaded Argentine radar detection and fire suppression, rapidly deploying troops near the summit of Mount Kent. As the 42nd Commando team landed atop Mount Kent, Argentine special forces had close to within less than 100 meters of the SAS team's defensive positions. With the firefight intensifying to a white-hot stage, the 42nd Commando members immediately joined the fray, coordinating with the SA team to launch a counterattack against the Argentine forces. The British reinforcements caught the Argentines off guard, instantly eroding their numerical advantage. Fierce battles erupted across the summit and valleys of Mount Kent, with the sounds of gunfire and explosions echoing through the wooded terrain. Armed with superior weaponry and seamless tactical coordination, British soldiers gradually gained the upper hand. After hours of brutal combat, they successfully repelled the Argentine special forces, firmly securing the crucial vantage point of Kent Hill. Subsequently, the British airlifted artillery units and heavy equipment to the hilltop, establishing robust defensive positions and observation posts that laid the groundwork for the impending final assault. Meanwhile, the remaining forces of the 3rd Assault Brigade, including the 3rd Parachute Battalion and the 45th Commando, were enduring a grueling march. With over 10 helicopters from the Atlantic conveyor lost at sea, the British Army's airlift capacity had drastically diminished, making direct transport of these units to the front impossible. Left with no alternative, the troops had to traverse the complex terrain of the Falkland Islands on foot. Advancing towards Stanley, winter had arrived in the southern hemisphere, bringing exceptionally harsh conditions to the Falklands. Bitingly cold winds swept across the islands, temperatures plunged to -20 degrees Celsius -4 degrees Fahrenheit, and blizzards became frequent occurrences. The island's landscape consisted mainly of mountains and hills, with few roads that were rugged and difficult to traverse. Most areas remained undeveloped wilderness, dotted with marshes and rocky terrain. Each soldier carried approximately 68 kilograms of equipment and supplies, including personal weapons, ammunition, cold weather gear, food, and medicine. Trotting through knee-deep snow and mud, daily marches covered less than 10 kilometers. Soldiers endured not only freezing temperatures and hunger but also constant vigilance against Pakistani patrols and ambushes. Many suffered frostbite on hands and feet, while others collapsed from exhaustion, yet not a single soldier chose to retreat. This treacherous terrain pushed both physical endurance and mental resolve to their absolute limits. As recalled by British soldiers who participated in the march, those days were a nightmare. We struggled daily against the biting wind and snow, resting only in makeshift tents pitched on the snow-covered ground at night. Food and water were scarce. Many froze to the point of losing consciousness. But we knew we had to persevere, otherwise we would lose the Falklands after over 10 days of grueling march. The remnants of the 3rd Assault Brigade finally reached the assembly point outside Port Stanley, linking up with the advance units and preparing for the final assault. While the 3rd Assault Brigade advanced with great difficulty, the 5th Infantry Brigade, commanded by Tony Wilson, embarked aboard the ocean liner HMS Queen Elizabeth from Southampton, UK. After nearly 20 days at sea, they successfully reached the waters off San Carlos, Falkland Islands. The 5th Infantry Brigade served as British reinforcements, comprising elite units such as the 2nd Scottish Guards and the 7th Gurkha Rifles, totaling approximately 5,000 troops. Their arrival boosted British ground forces on the island to around 10,000, significantly narrowing the numerical gap with Argentine forces. Accompanying the 5th Infantry Brigade was Major General Jeremy Moore, who assumed command of ground operations, unifying the leadership of both the 3rd Armored Brigade and the 5th Infantry Brigade. Moore was a seasoned military commander with experience in World War II and multiple regional conflicts, possessing exceptional strategic judgment and tactical leadership. Upon his arrival in the Falklands, he immediately convened an operational meeting. He received a briefing from Thompson on the battlefield situation and reassessed the deployment of forces and the operational posture of both sides. The core challenge facing British forces was how to rapidly transport the 5th Infantry Brigade to the front lines to link up with the 3rd Assault Brigade, forming a coordinated force capable of launching a decisive assault against the main Argentine contingent in Port Stanley. The sinking of the Atlantic conveyor had severely depleted British helicopter resources, making it impossible to transport all 5,000 troops and substantial equipment to the front within a short time frame. Advancing on foot would not only be time-consuming but also risk ambushes by Arab forces, leading to unnecessary casualties. After repeated deliberations, Moore and his command staff proposed multiple transport. Steel possessed formidable striking power. Landing troops via transport ships in this area would make them highly vulnerable to surprise attacks by Argentine aircraft, posing extreme risks. Furthermore, sailing around half the island's perimeter meant a longer voyage, leaving transport ships exposed at sea for extended periods and significantly increasing their vulnerability. Some senior British officers also noted that Wilson's actions essentially constituted a competition with the 3rd Assault Brigade for tactical initiative. As one official later recalled, it was clear that Tony and the 3rd Assault Brigade were locked in a race, each hoping their unit would be the first to reach the Stanley front lines, capture Stanley, and claim the war's first major victory. Within military structures, units often prioritize their own interests, sometimes viewing even allied forces as competitors. Despite strong opposition, Wilson persisted in his decision. Without explicit approval from Moore, he ordered a portion of his troops to board transport ships bound for a landing at Brave Bay. More outrageously, Wilson requisitioned the British Army's sole remaining Chinook heavy-lift transport helicopter without informing other field commanders. He deployed it to airlift a large contingent of paratroopers to Stanley Port's southern flank, attempting to rapidly complete troop deployment. This Chinook was the only helicopter then capable of mass transporting soldiers and heavy equipment for the British Army, originally earmarked to support the 3rd Assault Brigade's operations. Wilson's unauthorized requisition disrupted the 3rd Assault Brigade's supply transport. According to British soldiers who participated in the operation, Wilson issued a direct order to cram as many soldiers as possible into the helicopter. Even after it was full, he forcibly pushed the remaining soldiers into the cabin, preventing the helicopter doors from closing completely. This reckless decision nearly triggered a friendly fire incident. Without prior coordination with the 3rd Assault Brigade responsible for frontline surveillance, their troops mistakenly identified the helicopter with its abnormal flight pattern as Argentine military equipment. The brigade's air defense units had already locked onto the helicopter, preparing to launch missiles to shoot it down. Fortunately, the brigade commander confirmed the helicopter's identity via radio at the last moment, averting a tragedy. While friendly fire misidentification allowed some margin for error, encountering Argentine forces during the maneuver would have had irreversible consequences. The 5th Infantry Brigade's long march maneuver required circumnavigating half of the Falkland Islands, covering over 800 kilometers. The voyage alone took more than 17 hours, factoring in troop disembarkation, equipment transfer, and landing operations. The unescorted troop transport ships had to remain exposed in open waters for several hours during daylight. Although the Argentine Air Force had suffered heavy losses, it still possessed operational capability. If the troop transports were detected, they would be utterly defenseless, and the soldiers aboard would face certain annihilation. Tragedy ultimately struck. On the morning of June 8, 1982, the 5th Infantry Brigade's transport ships arrived at Bluff Bay, south of Stanley Port, and commenced landing operations. As the soldiers transferred to landing craft to approach the shore, 5 Argentine Air Force Skyhawk attack aircraft suddenly dove from the clouds, launching a surprise attack on the British troop transports. The Skyhawk, one of the Argentine Air Force's main combat aircraft, possessed strong low-altitude penetration and ground attack capabilities. This time, they were armed with heavy bombs specifically targeting the British troop transports. The British transport ships and landing craft were caught completely off guard, plunging into chaos. The Argentine aircraft's bombs struck 2 Royal Navy auxiliary vessels, Sir Tristram and Sir Galahad, with pinpoint accuracy. 2 massive explosions instantly engulfed the ships in fire, shrouding them in thick smoke. British soldiers aboard the ships jumped into the sea to escape, but many trapped in the compartments perished from burns or suffocation as they couldn't evacuate in time. British helicopters and landing craft in the vicinity immediately launched rescue operations, desperately trying to save survivors. Rescue personnel navigated the inferno, transferring wounded soldiers to safe zones amid utter chaos. This raid resulted in 56 British deaths and 150 injuries, marking the single deadliest and most chaotic military incident for the British during the heaviest casualties occurred aboard HMS Galahad, which carried soldiers from the 2nd Scottish Guards. 48 soldiers died and 115 were wounded. Many soldiers suffered severe burns in the explosions and fires, resulting in lifelong disabilities. The events at Bluff Bay led to the complete failure of the British Army's Great Leap forward maneuver and forced the postponement of their overall offensive plan. Subsequently, numerous British officers sharply criticized Wilson's decision-making, arguing that the leap forward maneuver lacked necessity. Julian Thompson explicitly stated that the 3rd Assault Brigade had been capable of launching a full assault on Port Stanley as early as May 30th. Had they attacked directly without waiting for reinforcements from the 5th Infantry Brigade, the war could have ended earlier, avoiding substantial unnecessary casualties. Most analyzers concluded that Tony Wilson bore primary responsibility for this tragedy, having spearheaded the risky maneuver decision while failing to ensure adequate protective measures and coordination during the operation. Following the Falklands War, Wilson became the only senior British officer not to receive wartime commendations. More than 6 months after the war's conclusion, in March 1983, he resigned all military posts, retired from the British Army, and relocated to the United States, gradually fading from public view. Regarding responsibility for the Bluff Bay incident, while the British military did not publicly punish him, it also withheld any form of commendation, an extremely rare occurrence in British military history, clearly indicating the military's disapproval of his decision-making. Despite the 5th Infantry Brigade suffering heavy losses, under Moore's coordination, its remaining forces ultimately completed the landing and linked up with the 3rd Assault Brigade on the outskirts of Port Stanley. At this point, the British ground forces on the Falklands had fully assembled, totaling over 9,000 troops equipped with ample ammunition and supplies, creating the conditions for a decisive assault on the Argentine main force in Port Stanley. Moore devised a detailed offensive plan based on troop dispositions and terrain features, dividing British forces into northern and southern groups. These groups would advance towards Stanley Harbor from the north and south, respectively, creating a pincer movement to progressively compress the Argentine defensive space and ultimately capture Stanley Harbor. 5 critical hill positions lay between Mount Kent and Stanley: Harriet Hill, Twin Sisters, Longden Hill, Mount William, and Rolling Hill. These hills formed an arc-shaped natural barrier guarding Stanley's outer perimeter. The Argentine forces had constructed extensive defensive fortifications on these 5 hills, deploying substantial troops and firepower to establish a tightly integrated defense system. These positions were regarded by the Argentines as the gateway to Stanley Harbor. Capturing these 5 hill positions would grant the British forces a direct overlook of Stanley Harbor, posing a lethal threat to the main Argentine force. According to British operational plans, the 3rd Assault Brigade was tasked with capturing the first 3 hills. The 3rd Parachute Battalion would take Mount Langdon, the 45th Commando the Twin Sisters, and the 42nd Commando Mount Harriet. After the 3rd Assault Brigade secured these positions, the 5th Infantry Brigade would take over the assault on Mount William and Mount Tumble, followed by a coordinated advance by both brigades into Stanley Town. To ensure the success of the main assault, the British also concentrated substantial artillery units on commanding heights like Mount Kent to provide fire support for ground forces. Simultaneously, British Harrier jets stood ready to deliver air strikes against Argentine positions at any moment. At dusk on June 11, 1982, the British launched their main offensive. Under intense artillery barrage, soldiers of the 3rd Assault Brigade charged Argentine positions on Harriet Hill, Twin Sisters, and Long Hill. The Argentines, entrenched in robust defenses, mounted fierce resistance, sparking brutal battles for every position. British troops advanced in alternating cover under cover of darkness, gradually closing in on enemy strongholds. On the Longdon Hill front, soldiers from the 3rd Parachute Battalion engaged in close-quarters combat with the enemy. Every trench and bunker was fiercely contested in repeated assaults, resulting in exceptionally brutal fighting. After a night of intense combat, the British forces finally captured Hallett Hill and Twin Sisters Hill by dawn the next day, then concentrated their strength for a fierce assault on Longdon Hill. By noon on June 12th, the 3rd Assault Brigade had successfully captured all 3 hill positions, eliminating hundreds of enemy troops while sustaining significant casualties themselves. Subsequently, the 5th Infantry Brigade took over the offensive, attacking the enemy positions on Mount William and Mount Tumble. By this point, the enemy's defensive system had been breached. Morale had plummeted, and they were unable to mount effective resistance. With support from the 3rd Assault Brigade, the 5th Infantry Brigade captured these 2 hill positions within a single day. Thus, the British forces had seized all 5 key hill positions in just 2 days, opening the route to Port Stanley. Having captured these 5 critical hill positions, British troops now stood at the gates of Port Stanley, encircling the city completely. At this juncture, Argentine Governor Menendez of the Falklands had unequivocally concluded defeat was inevitable. After multiple engagements, Argentine forces had suffered catastrophic losses, with fewer than 8,000 defenders remaining mostly wounded or inexperienced troops. Ammunition and supplies were nearly exhausted, rendering sustained resistance impossible. External reinforcement routes had been completely severed by British forces, leaving no hope of rescue. More critically, troop morale had plummeted to rock bottom, with many soldiers exhibiting war weariness and refusing to fight further. Menendez understood that continued resistance would only lead to more unnecessary casualties and greater losses for both sides. Therefore, after consulting with his officers, he decided to proactively contact the British forces to express his willingness to surrender. To avoid unnecessary conflict during negotiations, Menendez ordered all offensive actions to cease and ordered white flags to be raised, signaling the army's sincerity for peaceful talks. Upon receiving the surrender offer, the British command immediately responded, agreeing to negotiate with Menendez. Moore dispatched Special Air Service SAS Commander Michael Rose to Stanley to negotiate the terms of surrender. Rose, a seasoned British Special Operations commander with extensive negotiation experience, arrived in Stanley aboard a helicopter flying a white flag and engaged in face-to-face talks with Menendez. During the negotiations, both sides engaged in repeated discussions on the specific terms of surrender, ultimately reaching an agreement. The core terms of the surrender agreement were: Argentine forces would cease all resistance and unconditionally return control of the Falkland Islands to Britain. British forces would guarantee the safety and dignity of surrendered soldiers, treating them as prisoners of war in accordance with international law and repatriating them to Argentina after the war. Argentine civilians on the islands would be protected, with their lawful rights and interests safeguarded, and British forces would swiftly restore social order on the islands, ensuring the normal lives of residents. On June 14, 1982, the British and Argentine sides formally signed the surrender document. That afternoon, Menendez presented the surrender document to Moore in front of the government building in Stanley Port, then ordered Argentine soldiers to lay down their arms, exit their defensive positions, and surrender to British forces. At 19 o'clock that day, a formal ceasefire took effect, concluding the 74-day Falklands War with a British victory. On June 19th, British task force units captured South Sandwich Island, marking the complete conclusion of military operations in the Falkland Islands region. According to authoritative historical records, both sides suffered heavy casualties and material losses during this conflict. Argentine forces suffered 649 killed, 1,068 wounded, and 11,313 captured. British forces recorded 258 killed, 777 wounded, and 106 captured. Additionally, 3 Falkland Island residents lost their lives during the conflict, bringing the combined casualties to over 2,000. In terms of material losses, the Argentine military lost 90 aircraft and 5 ships, with direct economic damages exceeding $1 billion USD. The British military lost 34 aircraft and 6 ships, incurring economic losses of approximately $2.7 billion United States dollars. Furthermore, the war had profound impacts on the economic and social development of both nations. Looking back at the conflict, the Argentine Air Force undoubtedly emerged as the most outstanding force, responsible for the vast majority of British equipment losses and casualties. During the war, Argentine pilots demonstrated exceptional combat proficiency and courage, Despite operating aircraft inferior to British models and lacking aerial refueling and early warning aircraft support, they repeatedly penetrated British air defense systems to launch effective attacks against naval fleets and ground positions. Particularly during the San Carlos Bay landing operations, Argentine pilots delivered effective strikes while facing the dual pressures of intense British anti-aircraft fire and evading Harrier jet pursuit. Although many bombs failed to detonate due to low-altitude bombing, their heroic actions inflicted heavy damage on British forces. Post-war statistics indicate the Argentine Air Force sank 6 British vessels and damaged 12. Had the bomb rate not been so high, British losses could have been far more catastrophic. It is reasonable to conclude that had the Argentine forces been equipped with more Exocet anti-ship missiles and achieved a lower bomb failure rate, the course of the war might have taken a significantly different turn. In contrast, the performance of the Argentine Navy and Army was relatively lackluster. After the sinking of the cruiser General Belgrano, the Navy's main force withdrew from the battlefield and ceased participating in direct combat. This resulted in Argentina losing control of the seas and its supply capabilities, becoming one of the key factors in its defeat. Although the Army deployed substantial forces on the Falkland Islands, it suffered from ineffective command and coordination, poorly designed defensive fortifications, and inconsistent combat readiness among its troops. Facing British offensives, they failed to mount effective resistance, with most units quickly finding themselves on the defensive. Furthermore, the Argentine military junta's flawed decision-making proved critical to the defeat. Pre-war misjudgments regarding British intentions and inadequate wartime control over battlefield developments accelerated Argentina's collapse. Although the British ultimately prevailed, their campaign exposed numerous shortcomings. During the ground phase, the offensives against Darwin Port and Goose Green, along with the 5th Infantry Brigade's overambitious maneuver, were deemed strategically unnecessary. Rather than accelerating the war's conclusion, these actions delayed the advance and incurred unnecessary casualties. Furthermore, British equipment exhibited significant flaws. The Sheffield destroyer's air defense system had blind spots, rendering it ineffective against low-altitude missile attacks. The lack of effective airborne early warning aircraft made it difficult to anticipate Argentine fighter raids, resulting in the sinking of multiple ships. Nevertheless, British military strengths were equally evident. First, their rapid mobilization and response capabilities proved formidable. Within just 3 days of Argentina's occupation, they assembled and deployed a task force, demonstrating exceptional military readiness and national execution capacity. Second, the outstanding performance of British Special Forces and the flexible application of helicopter tactics were commendable. The Special Air Services behind enemy lines, reconnaissance, and special operations provided crucial support for tactical deployment, offering strategic value irreplaceable by conventional forces. Simultaneously, the British deployed over 200 helicopters of various types to undertake diverse missions including anti-submarine warfare, transport, resupply, and troop deployment. Employing leapfrog tactics, they rapidly seized key tactical points, effectively overcoming the constraints imposed by the Falklands' complex terrain on operational advancement. Furthermore, the British received international backing as multiple nations and organizations imposed economic sanctions and arms embargoes on Argentina, severing its weapon supply lines and creating favorable external conditions for the British victory. The victory in the Falklands War served as a powerful shot in the arm for Britain, then mired in economic stagnation. As the British task force returned home, it was greeted with enthusiastic celebrations. Ports like London and Portsmouth were packed with crowds welcoming the soldiers back. This triumph significantly boosted British national confidence and cohesion, dispelling the gloom hanging over society. British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher saw her approval ratings soar on the back of the war's success. In the 1983 general election, the Conservative Party secured an absolute majority victory, enabling Thatcher to secure a second term as Prime Minister. She would serve for 8 years, ushering in Britain's Iron Lady era. Economically, the Falklands victory stimulated Britain's military-industrial complex. Defense contractors saw a surge in orders, driving growth in related industries and partially alleviating recessionary pressures. However, the conflict also exacted a heavy economic toll. Direct losses of $2.7 billion strained Britain's finances, forcing the government to cut social welfare spending, a move that sparked public discontent. Diplomatically, Britain's relations with Latin American nations deteriorated due to the Falklands War. Most Latin American countries supported Argentina's sovereignty claims and opposed Britain's military actions. During the conflict, Argentina and Venezuela withdrew $7.5 billion in deposits from British banks. Simultaneously, several European nations seized the opportunity to raise agricultural product prices by 10.5%, dealing a heavy blow to the British economy. For Argentina, the defeat in the Falklands War brought catastrophic consequences. On June 17th, just 3 days after the war ended, the Galtieri military junta collapsed due to public discontent over the defeat. Galtieri himself was removed from the presidency and subsequently tried by a military court. The commanders of the air and naval forces were also replaced, marking the end of Argentina's military junta rule. Domestic pressure intensified for accelerated democratization. Economically, the war exacerbated Argentina's already severe economic crisis. To fund the conflict, massive capital flight occurred, triggering hyperinflation and soaring unemployment, pushing the economy to the brink of collapse. Statistics indicate that in the years following the war, Argentina's inflation rate exceeded 1,000%, causing a drastic decline in the standard of living for its citizens. However, Argentina's operation to reclaim the Malvinas Islands garnered widespread support from Latin American nations. They generally believed that Argentina's struggle was not only a fight to defend the sovereignty of a single nation, but also a fight to uphold the dignity and security of the entire Latin American continent. Since then, successive Argentine governments have consistently upheld their claim to sovereignty over the Malvinas Islands,